Welcome back to PHIL 2103, Introduction to Philosophy and Ethics. Now, in this lecture, we're going to conclude the business ethics section of the course. And as we've talked and already discussed, we've looked at the question like, what does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to be an ethical or moral person? And then we talked about how does a personal ethic play into a corporate scenario? How can personal ethics reflect or influence business ethics? Now I want you to put yourself into the shoes of someone who owns a company. You are a business owner for the next couple minutes as we talk here. And I want to present you a scenario that I often present in class. And so I want you to actually work through and wrestle through what happens in this scenario. I want you to think of what you would do and maybe even apply that ethical decision-making model that we looked at previously. So you own your business, and therefore your goal is to make money, as any capitalistic business has. You discover that you can cut millions of dollars from the bottom line if you lay off high-cost American workers and outsource those jobs to another country where you will be paying quite a bit less money off the bottom line and only be getting marginally lower results from this. What do you do? Now, this scenario has played out all too frequently, especially over the last decade here in America. I myself worked in corporate America for a time and went through a series of layoffs where the company presented it to us as simply, if we outsource these jobs, we are getting almost as good at work and results and numbers and bottom line, and we are paying significantly less money. And so even though it was seen by some as a slap in the face, the company ultimately just said, this is the right business decision. We have to look at the global community, the global market, and make a decision based on the bottom line. After all, we are a business, and we are in business to make money. And so through that lens, we had to ask, what is the responsibility of the company? If you're the business owner, what would you do in that scenario? Who are you ultimately responsible to? And when it comes to business ethics, this is one of the key questions, is who is a company responsible to? Let me present a few options in this regard. The first one would be your investors and shareholders. If you are a publicly traded company, you have a responsibility to those who own stock in your company. Typically, this means that the more money and the more profitable your company is, therefore, the more your investors and your shareholders are taken care of and happy. So if your primary responsibility is to your shareholders, then cutting those higher cost workers, which will give a better return on investment possibly, and therefore create more money, is the right thing to do. If your responsibility is to your profit margins, once again, this becomes the same scenario. If you can lower the cost of your workers, therefore earn more profit off of each dollar that's spent on any of your products, you have therefore helped your profit margins, which helps the investors and shareholders once more. The next one is to your employees. Now, as an employee of any organization, you hope that this is a top priority. A business should be responsible to their employees. If someone is figuratively or literally breaking their back every single day to make that product that you're going to turn around and sell, the employee should be a focus. And so you have companies looking at employee benefits, you have companies that look at health and wealth programs for their employees, or health and wellness, that is, for their employees. And so we start to see if a company is focused in on its employees, it will have to do things that are very different than if it's focused in on its shareholders. And so there has to be a balance that comes into play. Because adding a health and wellness program for your employees that will help them and make them happier cuts from the bottom line and makes it so that you must ultimately raise your costs somewhere to make up for that. So if your bottom dollar is primarily focused on your profit margins, your investors, then that health and wellness program is actually against what you would want to have in your bottom line, bottom dollar accounts. But if there's a focus on the employees, that has to be factored in somehow. The next one is the global economy. The world nowadays is so interconnected that there is no simple answer to say we are an American company, this is a Japanese company, this is a We are interconnected, and everyone tends to work in every market to some degree or another. The globe is interconnected. And so if you have a responsibility to the global economy, how will that impact the direction that your business takes? How will that impact the decisions that you have to make? The next is the local economy. Your business has a physical address, and wherever that physical address is, yet that is your neighborhood. That is your primary stomping ground, so to speak. But if you look at things from this lens, how does your responsibility to the global economy and your responsibility to the local economy around you intermingle? Because just as the health and wellness program is going to pull dollars from your bottom line that therefore reflects on your investors, your profit margins, and everything related there, so will the balance between the global and local economy. Because if you're making decisions that are based globally, a lot of times that may or may not reflect what decisions need to be made on a local scale. And so you see the tensions that start to arise. The next one, although it doesn't come into play for every business, unfortunately, is some form of a higher power, whether that be the God of the Bible, whether it be God of another religion, or pantheon of gods, such as in Hinduism. If there is a higher power that you're responsible to, then how does that come into play the decisions that you're making? If you are laying off employees, does that mean that you need to give them some form of sustainability for a period of time so that they can get back on their feet? Does your religious system speak to this end? Does the Bible say anything about what it means to have an ethical economic system? And as you found in the last video, it seems to, at the very least. And then lastly is the consumer. You have a responsibility to those who are receiving your product. If you employ persons of higher skills, the product will tend to necessarily become better. Now, those persons of higher skill may or may not be in your area, they may or may not be in the global market, but wherever they happen to be, if you employ those persons and spend more money, you're ultimately cutting from your profits, but increasing the product value to your consumer. And so at what point do you balance between what the consumer is receiving versus how much is going back into the bottom line? Because ultimately, if your company is not profitable, it is not working and operating within the realm of what it needs and requires itself to do. So, taking those 7 into account, what is your ultimate responsibility? If you are forced with laying off hundreds of jobs, thousands of jobs, but are going to be helping the bottom line, the profit margin, the shareholders, which one of those two tensions do you lean into more? If the employee health and wellness program is affecting profit margins, which one of those must be sacrificed? Think through these, because it's typical to give easy answers when in reality there is no easy answer to those scenarios, which is why the making ethical decisions model that we've looked at is so important. It's so important to take into consideration. Let me give you one last scenario. When I worked in the corporate world, one of the things that we ran into was in dealing in the global market, certain practices were accepted, other practices were not. So for example, when I was a senior accounts manager for this corporation, there was the ability for, or the tendency for certain countries to want to tip you, which in America we actually call bribery. They would give sums of money to earn business to a person or a salesman or someone within the company. And this was considered common and standard practice. However, in America, again, it's bribery, and we have rules against it. And so when I first came into this position and knew I would be dealing with a global market, I had to go through training about what it looked like to have international business ethics based on what is lawful here. So for example, if anyone in my division was given a gift over $50 in value, we were required to turn it back into the company because it was not deemed as acceptable and could actually be illegal in many instances. So when we deal with the international business market, we find that there are a lot more difficulties because certain cultures, for example, consider child labor not only acceptable, but a welcome part of their society. It's a way for children to give back to their families who may or may not be able to make it without that additional labor, without that additional set of hands working. Bribery, again, is common practice throughout the world, and it's not accepted here in America. Labor and worker safety is an issue in certain countries where it becomes more highly regulated in others. And so, for example, one area of the world you might go to may have extremely what we would consider unsafe work environments, but yet that is considered the norm and acceptable there. Excuse me. And then lastly is environmental safety. Certain countries have more strict regulations over what environmental processes and procedures must be employed than others do. And so if you are dealing internationally from one business to the other, these various effects start to come into play. What is your responsibility to the global market based on the laws that you're bound to in your own country, in your own land? These are some topics that you're going to need to dig into. And no matter what field of study you're going into, whether you're going to be a pastor, whether you're going to be an athlete, whether you're going to be a CEO, or whether you're going to be a cashier at the local grocery store, it doesn't matter, because business ethics, from the most basic scenario all the way up to these complicated international matters, affect us all more and more today. When you spend $1, you are voting with that dollar wherever you give that money to. And so when you buy a product or when you shop at a specific store, you are literally voting with your dollars as to what that company endorses, where they are headed, what their bottom line is. And so while it can be way too over our heads to research and to investigate every single company that we support, we need to be aware of how we are voting with those dollars. Because we as a society come together and decide which companies are going to make it and which companies aren't, based on whether or not we're buying their product. And that gives you something else to think about.